A warm welcome to today's video explaining the criticisms of virtue ethics. Now, in my previous video, I broke down the 5 working parts that you need to know. You may have just watched that. You may be thinking that you like virtue ethics, you like the sound of it, you like that it's different to deontology and to utilitarianism. But now you get the chance to evaluate the theory against the criticisms. Now, there are, as I said, 4 that you need to know. I've added a 5th one, which is a combination of lots of these, which I think is the strongest one of the bunch. So stay till the end so you don't miss that. Now, the first criticism we're going to look at is going to be a classic one, which is all about this. So, like in my previous video on virtue ethics, I provided a question at the beginning of each point. If you want to make this a more active form of revision, then you can answer the question before you listen and read my response. So, can virtue ethics provide sufficient guidance to act? Unlike deontology, unlike utilitarianism, there aren't these firm rules, principles, calculations in place for how we know what the right thing to do is. What Aristotle focuses on is our character. But does this give us enough to actually work on? Does this give us enough to know what to actually do in moral dilemmas? Because that's what we need it for. So the problem is, given the amount of decisions we need to make on a daily basis, there is this notion of decision fatigue. And you'll know this if you start a new job or are moving house or something of the sort, where because of the amount of new things that's going on, the amount of new decisions that you need to make, you can feel really quite overwhelmed and especially tired at the end of a day. And that's this idea of decision fatigue. So Aristotle doesn't help with this. In fact, he contributes to it. In deontology, for example, we have really clear, simple rules that in any situation we'll just know to follow them. Aristotle provides us this doctrine of the mean, where we need to balance lots of different virtues. We need to know when and how much of different virtues to apply. And ultimately, this is impractical. And the reason is because it's so fatiguing in any situation, whether you're driving your car and you're debating whether to let someone out, you need to sort of evaluate this in your mind. And there's so many decisions that you'll need to make on the basis of this, because there are no hard rules. This means that virtue ethics is rather impractical. And so there's no way of actually establishing right or wrong. This means that virtue ethics is not helpful for moral decision making, because it's all just based on virtues. It's not based on rules or principles as such. Now, the next criticism we're going to look at is going to be clashing virtues. So, virtues are not always harmonious with one another. You can look at Kant's axeman example, the mad axeman who comes to your door asking for the location of your friend. You have a duty, or rather not a duty, that's Kant. You have this obligation to develop your character, and so you want to be honest. You want to develop the character trait of honesty, and so you don't want to lie to the axeman, but at the same time you want to be loyal to your friend. You want to protect your friend from this mad guy at the door with an axe. And so this is a problem, and it's a problem because of the very minimal guidance that Aristotle does give, the doctrine of the mean, for example. Even that doesn't help us. And the reason it doesn't help us is because if I determine that the balance is going to be honesty and the golden mean might also be loyalty, these two clash. And so even with the doctrine of the mean, it doesn't help me, because I still need to decide between whether I am loyal or whether I lie, or whether I'm honest, rather. And so there's very little guidance, and of the guidance that is provided, it isn't helpful. You can also talk about in an exam the example of euthanasia. That's also a good one to use. This idea of duty of care. That's in the news at the moment. So by mounting these two criticisms together, you can provide this really strong account for virtue ethics being impractical. Now, the next criticism we are going to look at is going to be here. So, must the trait always lead to eudaimonia to be a virtue? In the same way that we can use these extreme examples of the axeman and euthanasia, we're now going to look at the example of war. So, in war, it may be appropriate to lie or to steal, for example. For whatever reason, you use your practical wisdom and you understand that you must lie or steal or cheat or in any one of these examples that don't contribute to eudaimonia. Okay, so if you just do it once, it won't contribute to eudaimonia, but you also won't habituate it, so you don't need to worry. The problem is that over a 5-year war, for example, you might need to habituate lying or stealing. And so you have habituated this character trait that doesn't contribute to eudaimonia. And the problem is this weakens the distinction between a virtue, an appropriate act, and eudaimonia. Because we can have this thing that in this specific case is virtuous, it is the right thing to do, it is appropriate, and yet it doesn't contribute to eudaimonia. Now, again, attacking the virtues, we are going to look at virtuous role models here. And now there's this circularity present. So how do we know who are virtuous role models? Who are our moral role models? So when we think about how we should act, well, we should act virtuously, not virtually, virtuously. But how do we know what a virtuous act is? Well, a virtuous act is something done by a virtuous person. Okay? But what's a virtuous person? Well, a virtuous person is someone who does virtuous acts. And now we see this circularity present between virtuous acts and virtuous people. A virtuous person does virtuous acts. What's a virtuous act? Well, a virtuous act is one done by a virtuous person. I know I've repeated myself a lot there, but hopefully that's clear in your head. So the circularity is an issue because without an account of virtue, we cannot change our character. We're reliant on these moral role models to habituate virtues. But if we don't know what virtues are, to begin with, we don't have this coherent account of what virtues are, then we can't change our character. We can't recognise ultimately what a virtue is because it's circular. We don't know what a virtue is. We look at virtuous people, they do virtuous acts, but we don't know that because, as I said, this account is incoherent. Now the final criticism, the strongest criticism, is below. And it's this idea of universality. So are virtues universal? Now a key critique here, a key critique to virtue ethics is that virtues are culturally relative. And throughout history, Aristotle has been criticised for just recognising the qualities that he sees around him in ancient Greece and saying, yeah, these are really good. These are the ones that we should do. Now, the reason why this is a problem is because it ultimately means that virtues are relative. And we'll get on to, in a second, why this is a problem. So, if virtues are relative, then virtues differ throughout time. The virtues of Victorian England are very different, or somewhat different at least, to the ones we hold now. Now, excuse me, I'm going to use an extreme example here to demonstrate the absurdity of the point. So, this means that a member of the 1930s German National Socialist Party is developing their character by being loyal and courageous and full of pride as well. So we can say that the National Socialist in Germany at this time is good and is contributing towards their character, because that's what it's all about. They're contributing, they're beginning to flourish and achieve eudaimonia by being loyal, by being courageous, by being brave, by having a sense of camaraderie. And yet, that means, because he's, this National Socialist is developing their virtues, but because they're relative, what we're ultimately saying, what this means is, given that virtues are relative, there is no external universal criteria for a virtue, then the flourishing as part of the Nazi Party is as virtuous as Aristotle and him developing his character in antiquity. And that's because virtues are good. Developing your character is the good. Eudaimonia, flourishing, is the good. And if that means developing virtues that are relatively good for your time, then that's what that means. And so developing virtues like loyalty, courage, pride in Nazi Germany is good. Being a Nazi, developing virtues in Nazi Germany is good. Okay? All this to say, what the virtuous account misses, so what's actually the issue? The issue is that what it misses is that there does seem to be a genuine right and wrong, which the agent-based approach cannot account for. So the reason I've used the Nazi example is because, I don't need to tell you this, but the Nazi regime is clearly wrong. I mean, obviously. There's nothing more wrong in modern history than the Nazi Party. And so what Aristotle misses with this character-based approach is that there does seem to be genuine things that are right and genuine things which are terrible and immoral. And by purely focusing on virtues, that isn't accounted for. Because we can account for virtues, we can achieve flourishing, and yet we can do that all whilst being part of the Nazi Party. And that is a problem. That's a real problem for an ethical theory to permit, to encourage the flourishing of a National Socialist in 1930s, encouraging them to develop their virtues with their praise of Hitler and their camaraderie of nationalists in Germany. That's an absurd position to get into. So it was all well and good developing virtues in a time which encourages virtues, like honesty, like in ancient Greece, or maybe in modern society as well. But developing virtues, because they're culturally relative, it might mean developing virtues and being a really virtuous Nazi supporter. And that's the key criticism of virtue ethics, in my opinion. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe and share the video with your classmates if you've enjoyed.